Right, well, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm here to talk about game production related to a KPI driven approach. So, specifically, what I want to talk about is that game design is a hypothesis, and your game production process should be a method by which you validate or not that hypothesis. And I want to talk about how you do that. So, this is perhaps a typical high-level milestone plan for a product game. But, what do these words actually mean? A vertical slice, alpha, beta, soft launch, whatever it is, I guarantee they mean something different to someone else. Because they're very arbitrary terms, they have no inherent meaning. How do we know what success looks like? And in particular, how does everybody working on the milestone know when it's been reached or is successful? To have a team that are all working towards the same goal, it's really important that everybody knows what success looks like. And also, how do we ensure that we're not biased by our own love of the game or our own opinion or just being so busy and heads down and believing that the game is great and on track when it's actually not? So let's talk about what sort of KPIs you could actually put in place to create sort of tangible criteria for success. So broadly speaking, these are the key KPIs that you need to consider. So we've got net promoter score. If you haven't heard this term, it's a term that is very broadly used. It's not a game specific term. It's used across many industries to assess customers' interest in a business or a product. It's very well established, very well regarded. But for games, you can do this through any kind of focus group or qualitative or feedback kind of testing. So you can use platforms like Playtest Cloud or Antidote. You could do it by showcasing at an event and getting feedback from players. But the point of an NPS, Net Promoter Score, is that you ask one question, which is, would you recommend this game to a friend? And it really is that simple. You can use your survey to ask for other things, but ultimately the evidence shows that asking that question is one of the most effective questions to measure potential loyalty into a product or a business, rather than asking, how much do you like this game? What's your rating of the game? And so on. It's the most qualitative of the types of KPIs that I'm going to talk about and that we do. But it's a really useful one. And it's particularly useful early on in your game development because you can be testing kind of your real core mechanic, your initial playable prototypes and things like that, and have a KPI associated with it, which is something reasonably tangible. You've then got cost of acquisition. So when I talk about this, I'm talking really about data points, typical data points like cost per install. So how much does it cost you to get someone to actually install your game, or cost per click. So how much does it cost you to get somebody to click on an advert about your game? And I could often see when I'm talking to developers who are more product-based and potentially not kind of making free-to-play or games as a service as much, that I lose their interest. As soon as I start talking about cost of acquisition, they kind of like, that's not related to us. Because for some reason it's become a term that's, well, I know why, but it's become linked to free-to-play, hyper-casual, and so on. But why? Why doesn't every game developer want to know how much it costs to acquire users? I mean, if you don't, how can you possibly forecast how much profit you're going to make? How do you know whether potential players relate to the theme and art style and actually will download your game in the first place? And what better way to test your art style or theme really early on than make a small trailer, spend 150 quid on Facebook and see how many people click the ad? That works for every game that's ever been made. It's a really useful thing to know how many people actually want your game, because the reality is that, you've got to get them to the point of downloading it and playing it. And if you can't get them to engage with your Steam page, with your Facebook ad, whatever else, then it doesn't matter how good your game is. You'll never actually get the players in the first place. And then you've got retention. So, in any game as a service, it's pretty obvious why retention matters. To spend money once and multiple times, players need to keep playing the game. But in product games, why is it important? Well, it's just as important because retention leads to two things. One, it leads to community, which most games want, and it also leads to recommendations, which all games need. So, if players download your game, play once and leave, okay, you've got their money in a product, but how likely are they to recommend your game to a friend? How likely are they to leave a good review? How likely are they to come back and complete the game and then recommend it to other people because they've loved it? Well, if they do all those things, it's pretty likely that they're going to join your community, they're going to engage, they're going to be a voice. But if they don't do those things, then you've lost players. And actually that's, you've lost potential new players and you've lost that kind of community engagement. So your specific KPIs that you use for retention will vary significantly. So, in a game as a service, you'll probably use, KPIs that we often talk about, like day 1 retention, day 14 retention, and so on. In a product, you might be looking at, I don't know, play session length, length, or how frequently they return, or at what point they drop out. Those are all retention KPIs. So your specific KPIs will vary, but you should still care about retention because you should care about your players. And even if they have already bought your game, you should care that they keep playing. And whether that's keep playing to the point where it's completed because it's a single playthrough type of game, it's still the same thing. How many of your players actually complete? How many of your players drop out at a specific point? The longer they stay in and play and engage, the more likely they are to contribute to the overall growth and new players. And then revenue. So ultimately, we're all running businesses. Businesses need to not just make revenue, but also make profit at some point. For most games, it's possible to test this pre-launch. You can run an early access campaign or a beta testing program or whatever else. And understanding your potential for revenue pre-launch is incredibly powerful. It can help justify spend on the game. And particularly, if you want to get a publisher or anyone who's going to fund marketing, then showing that your game can actually make money is a pretty powerful way to reduce the risk in marketing and marketing spend in particular. And all of the data that you've gathered to this point can help inform how you spend that money as effectively as possible on launch. For many games, the key KPI here that we talk about is ROAS, so return on advertising spend, which is literally revenue minus cost of acquisition. So how much do you make per player versus how much it costs you to acquire them? And ultimately, that's profit, right? And that's what you really care about. You need to know that you can make more money from players than it costs you to acquire them. And again, that is for every game ever, no matter what genre, what platform, or anything else. So how about we do a milestone plan based on that? So let's get rid completely of those arbitrary terms, alpha, beta, soft launch, and let's focus milestones on what we're actually trying to achieve. Let's literally make our milestones the KPIs that we're aiming for. What does this do? Well, first of all, it focuses us. Second of all, it makes sure that we are forced to look up and make sure that we're on the right track. And thirdly, it makes sure that everybody in the team who's working on the game all are working towards the same goal. So, typically you would start with something like an NPS test because you're testing the core mechanics. So you can test this with a really small playable. You can then use a CPI test or a CPC test, an acquisition test, to look at the art style and theme. You could put out 3 different trailers for 3 different art styles on Facebook, spend 50 quid on each, see which one people click the most. That tells you, that's like doing a poll or anything else, but a lot less, a lot more useful information. And it really demonstrates that your game has a market fit. You don't need to be spending huge amounts of money on these. Net promoter score, you could go to an event. Cost of acquisition, you can spend 150 quid. We're not talking about huge amounts of money. And then we look at gameplay. So, retention. So what is it that keeps people playing? So the net promoter scores told you that your core mechanic is great, brilliant. What makes people play beyond that? So what is it? The progression, the context, whatever else is it that keeps people playing, keeps people redoing that core mechanic over and over and over and over. And then finally, once you know that people love the core mechanic, that you've got a reasonable cost of acquisition, so people actually are attracted to it and want to download it in the first place, and you've got people coming back and staying long enough, then you start to look at revenue and you check, do people like to pay for it? Now, obviously, some games that's just a pay upfront fee. Others you need to actually check that they keep on paying as well. But again, the same principles apply. So how do we translate this into a production plan? Okay, so I'm going to explain this by showing how we do it at Fundamentally Games. Obviously at FG we're focusing very much on games as a service, or at least games that have some ongoing content. But the same applies to any games with slightly different KPIs, as I mentioned earlier. So what you first do is you work out your kind of overall KPIs. So these are our overall milestones here. You'll note there's no alpha, beta or anything. Instead, what we have is what we call readiness. So this is the stage where we're building the core game. It's the work we need to do before we can make the game publicly available all the time, right? So at this point, we'll be doing kind of closed tests, and just really working on that core game. It's probably what you would relate to alpha. Then we have what we call a UA testing program. This is where we have the game available to players. We're in a constant cycle of build, test, and iterate. It's a big transition between readiness and UA testing, because from this point, your game is live. Whether that's in early access or whether it's on a beta on Google Play, you need to support it, and you need to support the community, which is obviously a big task in itself. But that allows you to then create an environment where you're actually testing it and sort of simulating what you're going to have at launch. Then you get to launch, which obviously, hopefully, is fairly self-explanatory. And then at scale, post-launch, we grow the game long term. And depending on the type of game, depends exactly what you're doing here. But ultimately, if you've got any kind of updates going on in your game, then obviously that's going to be an ongoing process, which I'll talk about later. So taking those kind of previous high-level KPIs I talked about, this is how they would kind of fit. So really, readiness, you're looking at net promoter score, you're looking at cost of acquisition. Basically, you're really looking at those things that you can test without too much gameplay. I mean, arguably, you can cost of acquisition without any gameplay. You can fake a trailer, you could use some concept art, you could make some animation or do whatever you need to do. You can actually test that before you even start building. And I've seen cases of this, which has really helped inform the art style direction of the theme of the game, where people have done this before they even write a line of code. And then we tend to do an initial retention test to transition us between readiness and UA testing. So we will usually look at, say, an initial early stage retention to say, yes, we now are ready to go into UA testing. And from there, we really are looking at retention and revenue. And that takes us through to launch. So we'll spend quite a lot of time in UA testing. This is really akin to kind of beta and soft launch, typical milestones, but ultimately what we're looking at is, optimizing and improving and looking at getting more and more retention and more revenue potential. An really important point here, though, is that we never stop testing things. We're just adding new data points to the testing we're already doing. So we're always tracking cost of acquisition, we're always tracking retention, we're always tracking revenue. But the key KPI that you're measuring with success will change, and you're looking all the time at all of those data points to give you a bigger and bigger picture as you progress through of the potential success of the game. And once you launch, it's that never-ending iterative process, capturing data, checking what's changed, fixing issues and optimizing. And ultimately, again, you're looking at cost of acquisition, retention and revenue all the time. The reason I don't mention net promoter score, by the way, once we get further down the line, is because it is quite a qualitative thing. It's really much more useful at those early stages. The other thing it can do, though, is it can be very useful alongside, for example, a retention test, because a retention test can tell you, okay, we've got a problem with retention here, but it can't always tell you what that problem is. So a net promoter score can be a test where you actually get people's feedback and so on, can accompany that to inform what the issues are. So often we will run these things alongside each other to say, okay, so we've got an issue with retention here. What was the feedback from users? Is there something in that feedback that can help us work out what is causing that retention issue? So again, it's very much not seeing these things in isolation. It's about building a picture and looking at where your game is at any one point in time. What is the most useful data I can get? So from there, what we do is define our specific KPIs. So again, this is our version of it. In our overall readiness milestone, we generally have two specific milestones. We have an NPS test and we have a CPI and day one retention test. And what we want to see is that firstly, we get, decent NPS amount. We'll probably do that somewhere in the middle of the readiness process. And then to complete readiness and to move into UA testing, we want to see a CPI and day one test to confirm that we're ready to go. I also note I have got a CPI and day one test at the beginning there. The reason for that is because when you're doing data testing, there are two things. One is you have your KPI success criteria, critical. You want to know how you're doing against that. But you also, equally important, want to see rate of change. So you might not hit your KPI the first time you do a test. But if you can see that compared to what you were like on that KPI before you did this work, that it's moving in the right or the wrong direction, that gives you incredibly useful data in itself. So for example, you do a CPI day one test on a very early build. You then do a load of work, you do an NPS test, that goes well. At the end, then a few weeks later, you run another CPI day one test. You haven't hit your KPI, but you can see that through the work you've done, you've doubled your retention or you've halved your install cost. That's incredible. That's still a really good thing to show. So there's always two angles to look at KPIs, from success itself and also rate of change. Once you go into UA testing, then from our point of view, we're really focusing on retention. So we're looking at each time growing the retention. So are we retaining people at day 7? Are we retaining people at day 14? And ultimately, are we retaining people at day 30? And then we start to look at revenues. So ultimately what we're looking for is, are we making more money than we're spending? So we've got our cost per install number, and then we've got our revenue numbers in the game. Are we making more revenue than we're spending per player? So how do you translate this into a production plan? Well, the principle is that you build the minimum you need at each milestone to have the best chance of achieving the relevant KPI. If your team isn't working in this way already, this is a big change, and it is likely to meet resistance because it is really turning things on its head. And particularly if you're used to a methodology where the basis for success is if the team thinks it's good or not, it can be quite a difficult transition because you're basically switching from game designer-led approach to audience-led approach. And that can be quite difficult and will take time to adjust. Doesn't mean that game designers' opinion isn't valid, of course it is, but what they should be doing is being driven by what their audience is telling them. And I think one of Oscar's favourite phrases is always opinions firmly believe. What is it, Oscar? Opinions loosely held, firmly believed. You know, basically be willing to be wrong, essentially. Game designers. I had it in my head and I couldn't remember it. But yeah, and you know, that's my belief is what a game designer needs to be. They need to be passionate. They need to really believe in the hypothesis they've got, but they need to know it's a hypothesis, and the only thing they can guarantee is that something they have designed will not work for their audience. It's impossible that anybody could be right about everything in a game design, and it's really important that, you know, you have designers who listen and understand and want to build what an audience wants truly. And I think it's very easy to believe that you want that. To actually do it is much harder because it's your baby, and sometimes, you know, you have to make decisions that you really don't want to do because you thought something was really good. And that is a difficult transition to do, but I think it's also an absolutely critical one. You know, you may find that features you thought were amazing don't work, or need iteration, or completely need ditching. And you can't predefine exactly what you're going to do at each milestone in this method, right? Because you have to allow for reaction to the test results of the previous milestones. You also have to allow for a test to fail and need time to redo it. But, you know, what is important is between all the milestones, you're testing all of those key KPIs, core mechanic, acquisition, retention, revenue, as much as you can at the point you're at. And then, you know, by association, ensuring that you're not missing any key elements of the game. Now, this may sound obvious, but a lot of our consulting and sub-training work with developers is analysing game design or a game playable and identifying where there are gaps in the design. So where there are no features or content to address certain things. And I honestly, I mean, I can't think of a single instance where we haven't done this audit of a game and not found a gap or a missed opportunity by going through this very methodical process of thinking about core mechanic, acquisition, retention, revenue. You know, we usually are spotting a missed opportunity, a gap, something that can be added in. And also, I don't think I can think of a single instance where we haven't said, don't do that feature before launch. Don't bother. It doesn't have enough benefit to your game. So really, you know, thinking about all the ideas that you want in the game, but then analysing them in terms of the benefits they bring, and do they cover all the bases you need to cover is a really important. And that's, you know, whilst that's obviously a design thinking thing, it is a scoping exercise, and therefore, you know, production needs to be involved in terms of ensuring that, you know, for this milestone, we need to test day one retention. Okay, to test day one retention, what do we need? Well, we need a core mechanic. And we need some kind of progression that will give people a reason to come back on day 2. What are those things? Okay, well, that helps you define the scope. For day 7 retention, what do we need? Well, we need reasons for people to feel like they're progressing and they're actually achieving something so that they come back after 7 days. What is it in our set of game design features and content that we've got planned that will achieve that. Let's develop that. Does that feature there help us to achieve that? But we really, no, then don't develop it in that milestone, and so on. Now, none of us want a game to fail, and none of us, want to fail. Ultimately our ideas and our darlings. But ultimately, if you're going to fail, it's better to know sooner. It's never possible to completely remove the risk of failure at launch, and anyone who tells you it is probably lying, but it is possible to significantly reduce the chance of failure. One of the biggest problems with arbitrary milestones, in my experience, is it's very easy to persuade yourself that things are fine. It's very easy to persuade yourself that even if things aren't fine, that you can fix it. A similar issue applies to qualitative data. So user feedback, if it's not handled very carefully, it's very easy to interpret data in a biased way without even being aware you're doing so. And in addition, when your head's down in development, you're busy, tired, focused, passionate, seeing the wood for the trees can be really, really difficult. And it can take a long time, if ever, for you to realize that you're on the wrong path. So having these predefined, tangible, measurable KPIs is a critical way of forcing you to really face up to issues that you're coming up against. And it does help you to identify when things aren't going right. And also ultimately helps you to identify when is the moment to cancel the game, if that's what's needed. And it's better to do that when you've still got some money left that you can make another game. So saying all of that, KPIs are only as good as their criteria and also as the interpretation of them. So how do you know what KPIs are set? Well, if you don't know this, so, the two places I would start are firstly, learn about industry and market norms, right? Talk to people, read articles, listen to talk at events. There are norms for, to be honest, all platforms and games. But there are also just general norms. You then research your competitors and your market, whatever sort of market you're in, and get data from those games, which either you can find online, talk to other developers, and so on. But ultimately, you should be able to establish what your KPIs are and what the goals are for those KPIs. So for our KPIs, and obviously this is kind of a games as a service general approach, I know what our norms are, and I know broadly what variations we'll need to make per platform or per game genre. From there, we do make further adjustments based on the specific game, but that's where I rely on the game designers to kind of tell me more specifically what it is that we need to adjust. So for example, these on the screen here are some default KPIs that I'd be looking for. So if I was running a CPI test on a game, pretty much any game, I would want to ideally see that it cost less than $1 to acquire a user. If it was less than $1.50, I'd probably be okay. But ultimately, particularly when you're running a small CPI test, you know that CPI costs will increase as players increase, and therefore I know that I need it to be pretty low so that I can grow it from there. NPS, I know that I want, either, if I'm giving a star rating to people of, would you recommend this to a friend, 1 to 5 stars? I'd like 4 out of 5 as the average. If I got 3 out of 5, I'd probably be okay. And retention, I've got various, KPIs that are pretty standard. So for example, day one, you want, a minimum of 45% of users retaining day one retention, so that by the time you get to day 30, you've got enough people left to actually start paying. But it also changes over time. So I know that if I do a day one retention test early on, I probably will only get 25%, because I know that longer term retention positively impacts shorter term retention. So if I'm running a day one test during my readiness phase, I'm okay if I get 25%. I mean, I'm not over the moon, but I'm okay about it. But I'll keep checking day one retention every single test we do. And by the time we get to launch, I want to see it at 45%. So, you need to understand the KPIs and the data. And this comes from experience, but it also can be gained from talking to other people and learning and listening to what other people have done and their experiences. As I said, I know that CPI cost increases as audience grows. The more people you need to acquire, the more cost it's going to be. So you need to start with a low number and expect it to go up. I know that on PC games, it often costs more to acquire people than mobile games. There are these market norms that if you are the one responsible for this sort of stuff, you need to be learning. And that may be your game designer who is learning this. It might be you, but whoever it is, somebody needs to know this information. I also know that CPI doesn't just rely on the game, right? It relies on a good trailer, good targeting, someone who knows how to set up Facebook ads. And those can significantly impact the difference in the CPI test. So initially, when I run a CPI test early on, the game might not look amazing, so my trailer isn't great. Or maybe I've just done it on the cheap and done it myself, and I'm not the best trailer creator, but it's the best I could do. So I take that into account. So if I'm not getting the best CPI data, then a few months down the line, maybe I spend a bit more money on a trailer and I've got a better footage from the game, and then I check my CPI again and I can see that it's improved. Or maybe I do a few different CPI tests. But either way, the context of your KPIs, the rate of change, the point at which you're at, those things matter. So you can't just take these things in pure isolation, but it is really important to understand the context and understand the rationale of why you're seeing the data you're seeing. So what about once you're launched? Well, the way I like to think about games is a set of scales with coins balanced on them. You've got acquisition on one side and retention on the other. Thinking about only one of these unbalances the scale and money pours away down the drain. If you spend loads of money on acquisition, but you don't have good retention in the game, it's wasted. Now, in a pay upfront game, you might say, well, it's not because I've got their money. Yeah, you have, so it's wasted less. But if they don't retain, they don't tell other people, and so your cost of acquisition goes up. Because ultimately, what you need in a PC pay upfront game is word of mouth. You want organic as much as you do paid, probably more, right? So you should care, because the better retention you have, the more organic you will have, and therefore the cost of acquisition goes down, because you pay for one user, they tell 3 other users. If you have to keep paying directly because you have no retention, you are going to make less profit and you're going to get less players. Equally, if you spend loads of money making your game awesome and retaining, but don't spend money on acquiring users or don't do acquisition effectively, then you've wasted money building your game because the players won't come. And types of acquisition vary. So, in a game as a service, you might be doing direct acquisition. So, ads might be your primary way. On a PC game, on a console game, for example, you're going to do very little ads because that's not necessarily the best way. You're going to spend more money on streamers. That's still acquisition. Any marketing activity is acquisition. It's just about how direct it is. So, press is acquisition. Probably the least direct, because you have no way of seeing the direct thing between I've got that article in Eurogamer to I got this number of players. But it builds awareness of the game, and that in itself generates acquisition, indirectly. So every type of marketing is acquisition, and it's just about how direct it is and how tangible it is. And really your job is to try and work out how can you track that cost of acquisition. If you're doing only those kind of indirect things, it's much more difficult to track. But you can track it, because you can say, I spent this much money on marketing and I acquired this number of users and made this much money. So it is still possible to do, but you won't be able to track the kind of the attribution to a point to know exactly what worked and what didn't. That will have to come through more experimentation or experience, frankly. But it's still the same thing. So your job, your team's job, is to constantly be measuring and ensuring that those scales are balanced. So every single change you make to the game, to acquisition, you change targeting in a Facebook ad, you change the streamers you work with, you get a new streamer, you get a bad review, you change something in your game, it will affect that balance. And so you can never sit back, you're always iterating and optimizing. And the idea is that before you even launch, you're trying to optimize and balance that as best as possible. Now, if you have a game that's purely a product with no ongoing updates of any kind, then your ability to impact retention beyond launch is going to be limited. It's not going to be zero, though, because you still have community activity, right? But your focus in reality is going to be on a heavy marketing campaign to acquire as many users as possible on day one. And you better hope that you got your retention good in your game before you launched. So, arguably, I would argue that for a product, you need to be even more on the case with retention in advance, because you can't change it later. At least with a game as a service, you can change it later and optimize it and improve it if you find it's not quite right. If you have a game that has some updates planned but isn't kind of a full service, so maybe you've got DLC every 3 to 6 months, then your job is to make sure that that DLC is effective as possible. And essentially each DLC you're kind of treating as a launch day, right? So launch day, as with a pure product, your marketing campaign goes into that. You hope that it's balanced. 6 months later, when your DLC comes out, you basically do the same thing. You're going to focus on heavy acquisition campaigns on day one, and then for every DLC launch. And your job is to try and make sure that every DLC launch keeps that balance and optimizes ultimately your profit. If you have a full game as a service with events, promotions, content, feature updates, then it's a constant focus every day, every week, every month of focusing on both retention and acquisition, where you gradually build acquisition and you ensure that retention doesn't slip as you do. Now, this is why when a game as a service launches, you don't necessarily have the massive marketing push on day one, because actually you don't want to do that because it might unbalance things. You want to gradually increase, making sure, and as you grow the spend, you also grow the retention and revenues. Because retention leads to revenue. So, you're constantly balancing that, and you're making sure not only that you're increasing the acquisition, but the cost of acquisition is staying reasonable to what your revenue, and the idea is you grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So they're different techniques, but it's ultimately the same thing, right? You've got to care about both sides of the scales. You've got to care about it from day one. And if you are not testing from arguably before you start building your game, then you are missing an opportunity to make the best thing for your audience and to make the thing that can be most successful. So just before I sort of wrap up, I just wanted to kind of give some how to get started. If you've never taken this approach before, you're probably like, this is completely different. So what would I do if I wanted to get started right now? Well, I would do 3 things. One is I try to find 3 key KPIs and their success criteria for my game. 1 for acquisition, 1 for retention, and 1 for revenue. Longer term, you're going to want to create more, but just as a starting point, research and identify what those KPIs should be for your game. And like I said, some games, there's going to be more information online. If you're making a game as a service, then, there's a lot more talk about this stuff, but actually there's also a lot to talk about product. People just don't talk about it in this way. So what is it? A KPI for each of those. Then for each of those 3 things, 3 KPIs, what would you implement in your game? The minimum amount to be able to test that. So what test would you do? So if you want to test CPI, what is it? Well, it's 150 quid Facebook test. If you want to test play sessions, how much of the game do you have to be able to test that play session? So what is it a minimum that you need implemented in terms of how much gameplay, what features, what content, etc. And then for each of those tests, define a production plan around them and ensure that you're saying, our hypothesis is that for this test, for day 7 retention, we need to build these features and content. And if we do that, we believe that that's our best chance of hitting that KPI. So that's what you build. You leave then time for the test and you leave time to iterate. And then you build your entire production plan around that. Now, obviously, as I showed earlier, we have a lot more tests and a lot more KPIs as we go, and you will want to build those out. But if as a sort of exercise to get you thinking in this way, you did it based on those 3 KPIs, and I think that would be a really good starting point. And that's really it. I mean, hopefully you know what Fundamentally Games does. We're a publisher. We also do consulting and training, and we help people to commercialize and make awesome games. So if you want to talk to us about that, please speak to us afterwards. We also have a load of free resources and information. Obviously you're here, so I'm assuming you know about our webinars, but we also have the Discord where you can chat to us. We have a load of information on our knowledge base, including all our previous webinars and various other information. And we've got a financer list and free templates and all kinds of stuff. So please reach out. Well, I'm happy to answer questions now, but if you have any questions otherwise, then please reach out on Discord. I think that's it, Oscar. Mhm. Go for it. Yeah, I think so. Yes, I mean, I think, look, at the beginning, the reason we use it at the beginning, frankly, is because when you've only got a core mechanic and a very small amount of gameplay, there isn't really other testing you can do. So that's why we focus on that at the beginning. However, there is value to doing it later, and we do, because what it can do is give you insight into the other forms of more quantitative data, so you can run it alongside another test. But it's also very difficult to scale, right? So it's, you could, for example, put a game out, have a survey when they've played the game for 30 minutes where you ask them, would you recommend this to a friend? And that can give you really useful information alongside other testing. So I mean, what I would say is I would never rule out doing multiple tests. And as I said earlier, like, you're building on the previous types of tests. The reason we don't do NPS as much as the others ongoing is because it's expensive and because the value of the data becomes less once you've got more quantitative data. But if you're using it to augment and give you insight into those other data, then it's really useful. But as a marketing tool in itself, it's not going to be the most effective, to be honest. I think that's fair, Oscar. Yeah, I mean, when we're doing the NPS test early on, we're usually testing on, I mean, I would love to, to test on 20, 30 people. Sometimes you don't even have the budget for that, right? Playtest Cloud and that can be fairly expensive. I mean, test on 5, 10. Yeah, exactly. And that, yeah, I think our average is probably, if I look back, around 5 to 8 people, I would say, that we do it. And again, as long as you understand the context, as long as you understand it is qualitative, that it's not definitive, that it's just a tool to provide you insights and give you another view into the game, then it's incredibly useful. If what you want is quantitative, then it's not that. But there are better ways to do that, like running a Facebook test. Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, hopefully this is well, no, but never, ever, ever test on your friends, ever. It doesn't matter how much they believe they are unbiased. It is physically impossible for them to be unbiased. Don't do it. Full stop. Mm. Mm. Yeah, again, it can be used to give insight into why you're getting the data you're getting elsewhere. Like, you might find that people have given you useful feedback and you're like, oh, that explains why I've got a problem with that retention or that thing there. That's where that information can be useful. It cannot be useful on its own. I agree. Mhm. So I would sort of go back to what I was saying earlier, which is work out what your KPIs are throughout define some milestones. Start with 3, which is, as I said, a simple, sort of, I would say, a fairly good starting point. Or think about core mechanic, acquisition, retention, and revenue, and basically assign those features to those things. Do you have enough features in the game that are for retention? Because often what we find when we do this with developers is that they've got loads of features for core mechanic, but actually most of them won't help with retention. For example, they're really cool and they sound amazing, but actually they're not going to help with this thing here. So actually those features shouldn't be in there. So that would be where I would start. And I would really think about, making sure that you cover all of those bases. And again, I don't know what type of game it is. If it's a game as a service, then making sure that you've got, well, okay, if it is a game as a service, then you also need to think about, how are you going to update the game every day, every week, every month, every quarter without killing your team? So you need updates that aren't, heavy on resource. So, don't require tech, don't require art, and then others that do. So that's a whole thing in itself. I think we've probably got other talks about that, but I'm very happy to talk about that. If it's a game as a service, then with monetization, you want to make sure that you've got enough things of value that people will actually want to pay for, and that you can keep building those out longer term. So if it's games as a service, those things as well. But even if it's not, then looking at, well, do you cover all the bases in terms of providing all of those elements, the core mechanic, the progression, the social capital elements, whatever else it is. And by social capital, and I know Oscar's got webinars about this, so I'm not going to try and pretend I'm a game designer, but making sure that there are reasons for people to show off, or reasons for people to engage, or whatever else it is, in the game. So the other way to look at it is Oscar's kind of thing where he talks about core mechanic, context loop, and metagame, and making sure that you've got features for all of those different elements. And that's probably what I'd do, actually, Oscar. I would take your 3 you've got. I don't know if we can reference it, maybe send a link or something, but I know you've done a talk where you've looked at those 3 core loops and the different things that you need in each of those, like social capital, lifestyle fit, etc. I would be associating my features with those, and then I would associate my features with 3 key KPIs, and I would see what the key features are that come out of that, and what ones I remove, and where I'm missing something. Yeah. Uh, what I would say is, I think what we're both saying in a very simple way is question every feature of why it exists. If the only answer you've got is I think it's cool, then it's probably not good enough. You need to really think about what does that feature add to what I've already got. And what you'll probably find is that some add a huge amount and others don't. And you might also find that there are quicker wins to achieve a KPI. So you've got a feature that you think is awesome, but it's going to take 6 months of dev for 3 people, whereas actually you could achieve that by a smaller feature which is going to take one person 1 month. So it's really thinking about what are the quickest ways to achieve, quickest and most effective. Like obviously ultimately we're trying to build an awesome game here, and that is that sits beyond all else, and that's kind of assumed here, but what is it that will achieve each KPI? And why am I adding that feature apart? What reason is it beyond? Yeah, and I think I'm doing an editing on Friday, aren't I, Oscar? Oh, wait, oh yeah, but yeah, I'm happy to answer questions on Discord anyway. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the context in which we run NPS tests is slightly different to that. So I agree, if it's on a, people review a game, on the app stores or whatever else, they're going to only review it if they love it or hate it. But, if you're running, for example, an NPS test on Playtest Cloud or Antidote, you know, or in another context, it's a slightly different thing because they're being asked their opinion. And so therefore it is a slightly different context. And it's also the reason why NPS, the question of would you recommend it to a friend, is asked, and why you do not ask how much do you like this game 1 to 5. In fact, it's exactly the reason why NPS tests as a concept exist, and it was actually something that was introduced in Harvard Business Review, I think in about 2003, the NPS score. So you can go down a rabbit hole understanding the theory behind it, but that is basically why it exists, because the evidence shows that if you ask people how much you like this game, they will give an extreme view. If you ask them, would you recommend it to a friend, they give a much more measured approach. And so that's literally why NPS exists. But again, it's very qualitative. It's useful at small numbers. But it's the biggest thing I would say. I see a lot of developer surveys where they're asking, rate this game 1 out of 5. There's basically the answers you'll get to that won't be very useful. If you ask them, will you recommend it to a friend, it will be more useful. Mm. Say that. Starting phase of game development. So yeah, so I would do a cost per install or cost per click test, probably a cost per click test before I even start development, to have a like a little faked trailer to see with 2 or 3 different art styles and themes to check that people like the concept of the game and would actually buy it. So I do that before I started development, like whilst I was in pre-production. I would then, first thing I'd do is I'd spend, I don't know, I mean, it depends on the size of the game, but 6 weeks making a small playable that I would then try and do an NPS test on the core mechanic. I mean, if your game's going to take 5 years, you're probably going to be 6 months, but the smallest thing you can do to build out the core mechanic, and I'd do an NPS test on it with, like we said, 5 or 8 people. If that goes well, then I would build out a bit more. I'd build out some reasons to come back on day 2, which could be faked, by the way. Like, you don't have to implement everything fully. And as quickly as possible, I'd rerun another Facebook test with a trailer, but this time which goes to the game, so I can test CPI and day 1 retention. And I would be trying to do that in the first 2 months of dev. Soft launch. So you're building the game from the start of readiness. So readiness would be what you probably would call alpha in a traditional model. So it's the building of the game before you can really have it available to users all the time. Right, so it's really the core mechanics. It's building out something. Once you complete readiness, then your game needs to be ready. It's, for example, it might be when you would go into early access, right? So the beginning of UA testing is when you'd go into early access, as a typical example. So readiness would be all this stuff. Mm. Yeah, so I mean, bearing this is kind of an overall milestone, and you have multiple milestones in it. As a developer, I would be looking at as all of the production milestones that you need to do before you can put the game live to players. Basically. So, yeah, I mean, it's obviously. Oh, sorry, go for it. Yeah. I mean, if you want to try and draw direct parallels, then I would say, readiness is alpha, UA testing is beta and soft launch. And the difference in that context between beta and soft launch would be that beta would be private testing or closed testing, and soft launch would be open testing. So at some point during that UA testing process, you want to decide when you go from closed testing to open testing. We do it pretty early on. It does depend on the game. But as Oscar said, with PC, it's basically on early access or not. So PC, you're basically readiness. You're not in early access. UA testing, you're in early access. On Google, then you're probably going into the beta, open beta testing early on during the UA testing process. But it's all about, rather than it being just about closed versus open, it's about how many testers you need at each stage to get relevant data, and how you grow your audience over time. So if you have closed testing, you're going to have small numbers of players, and that's fine for a CPI day 1 test. But by the time you get to day 30 testing, for example, you need to have quite a lot of players, and therefore you probably need to be in open testing to be able to acquire enough users to actually get useful data. So you will be partly driven by that as well. Yeah, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier, is that those sort of tests can help you understand why you're seeing the data you're seeing, but they are not data in themselves, in my view. Mm. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, and I think I wouldn't. I think there's huge value in it if it's to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to make sure that I didn't sound like I was undervaluing it. I think it's incredibly useful as long as you're using it correctly, which is to understand the actual data you're seeing. Because I think then it can be difficult to interpret. Okay, I see a problem in the data here. Well, why? And actually you might find that people in your team disagree about why, and that can be difficult. Right now, you can run tests, you can try things to validate it. Okay, person A thinks that the problem is this. Okay, well, we'll build something to but there's only so much of you can do. The more information you can get about trying to understand why you're seeing the data is useful, and if there is a way to use that sort of research to help you answer a specific question, then I think it can be really useful. But again, I would say it needs to be for a specific question and for a specific reason and linked to specific data points.